You're certain you finished the report on time, but your manager insists you missed the deadline, and slowly you start doubting your own memory. Psychologists call this gaslighting, a pattern where someone repeatedly denies your version of events until you stop trusting your own recall. In workplace research on toxic management, this shows up as a deliberate tool, not an accident. The denial is calm, confident, and repeated. A manager who says, "I never approved that," after clearly approving it, makes you question your own notes. A boss who insists your work was late when your email timestamp proves otherwise makes you doubt the timestamp instead of them. A supervisor who rewrites the story of a meeting makes the whole team quietly agree because disagreeing with the person who signs your paycheck feels riskier than staying quiet. It works because most people trust authority over their own perception, especially when their job depends on it. This sounds like a misunderstanding, but real misunderstandings get resolved with evidence. Gaslighting doesn't. Notice if your memory only feels unreliable in meetings with this one person. Because your recall isn't broken, it's being overwritten. If this project fails, I don't know what happens to your position. The words aren't a threat exactly, but the fear they create shapes every decision you make afterward. Psychologists studying persuasion have found that fear narrows thinking down to the fastest way to make the discomfort stop, which is exactly why fear-based management is so effective at getting fast compliance. A manager who hints at layoffs right before asking for unpaid overtime isn't sharing company news, they're applying pressure. A boss who says, "I'd hate to see this reflect badly on you," before a hard task isn't being protective, they're planting dread. A supervisor who keeps your job security vague on purpose keeps you working harder than one who's simply honest about expectations. It works because fear shuts down the part of your brain that would otherwise ask whether the request is even reasonable. This sounds like accountability, but real accountability comes with clear standards, not vague dread. Notice if the fear appears right before a request, not as a response to actual performance. Because leadership built on dread isn't leadership. It's control wearing a badge. This needs to be done by tonight, no exceptions. The deadline feels absolute, and you drop everything, only to find out later the actual deadline was next week. Psychologists studying decision-making have found that urgency pushes people away from careful thought and into fast, unquestioning action, which is exactly why manufactured urgency is such an effective management tool. A manager who claims a deadline is immovable when it isn't managing time, they're managing your compliance. A boss who says, "The client needs this now," without ever naming the client, isn't relaying pressure, they're inventing it. A supervisor who creates weekly emergencies that always seem to resolve just before the real deadline isn't dealing with chaos, they're manufacturing it to keep you moving fast. It works because urgency shuts down your ability to ask whether the request is even necessary. This sounds like a demanding job, but real demands come with real deadlines that don't mysteriously shift once you've rushed to meet them. Notice if the emergency evaporates the moment you actually deliver. Because urgency that keeps changing shape was never about the deadline. It was about keeping you moving. You spend weeks building the plan, and in the meeting, your manager presents it as their idea, and somehow you're the one who ends up thanking them for the opportunity. Psychologists studying workplace power dynamics note that credit theft works precisely because challenging a superior in front of others carries social risk most people aren't willing to take. A boss who says, "We came up with this," after you built it alone, isn't summarizing teamwork, they're erasing your name from the record. A manager who presents your analysis to leadership without mentioning your role isn't being efficient, they're borrowing your effort as their own achievement. A supervisor who only credits you privately, never in front of anyone who matters, isn't protecting the team's image, they're protecting their own. It works because most people won't correct a superior publicly, and the manipulator is counting on exactly that hesitation. This sounds like humility on your part, but real humility doesn't require your accomplishments to disappear. Notice if your name only appears in private thanks, never in the rooms where it counts. Because credit that vanishes in public was never really shared to begin with. You send an update, and your manager goes quiet for days, offering no feedback, no acknowledgement, nothing to work with. Psychologists studying workplace control describe this as strategic silence, a tactic that works precisely because it leaves nothing concrete to point to. A manager who stops responding until you circle back anxiously isn't overwhelmed. They're establishing who has to chase whom. A boss who withholds feedback until you've asked 3 times isn't disorganized. They're conditioning you to always initiate contact first. A supervisor who freezes out one employee while responding instantly to everyone else isn't randomly busy. They're disciplining through absence. It works because uncertainty is uncomfortable, and most people will do almost anything, including over-apologizing or over-explaining, just to end the discomfort of being ignored. This sounds like a distracted manager, but a truly distracted manager is inconsistent across the whole team, not selectively silent toward you alone. Notice if the silence lifts the moment you show anxiety about it, because real distraction doesn't have a target. Strategic silence always does. You're handed a project with an impossible deadline, unclear instructions, and no support, and somehow it still feels like your fault when it falls apart. Psychologists studying workplace sabotage note that being set up to fail rarely looks dramatic. It looks like ordinary mismanagement, until you notice the pattern repeating specifically around you. A manager who assigns you a task with resources they know are insufficient isn't testing your resourcefulness. They're building a case against you. A boss who gives verbal instructions instead of written ones, then denies what was said, isn't being casual. They're leaving no evidence to defend yourself with. A supervisor who excludes you from a key meeting, then criticizes you for not knowing what was decided there, isn't an oversight. It's a setup. It works because each individual incident looks like normal workplace friction, and only the accumulated pattern reveals the intent. This sounds like bad luck, but bad luck doesn't consistently target the same person while sparing everyone else. Notice if the missing piece is always something only your manager controlled, because failure that's engineered doesn't feel different from failure that's earned, until you count how often it happens to you specifically. Your manager mentions that another coworker said something critical about your work, and suddenly you're suspicious of a colleague you used to trust completely. Psychologists call this triangulation, a control tactic that keeps a manager at the center of information by turning coworkers against each other instead of communicating directly. A boss who relays secondhand complaints instead of addressing issues directly isn't being helpful. They're manufacturing tension they can later manage. A manager who tells 2 employees separately that the other is the problem isn't mediating. They're dividing a team that might otherwise compare notes. A supervisor who keeps information asymmetric between team members isn't protecting privacy. They're making sure no one has the full picture except them. It works because a fractured team is easier to control than a united one, and manufactured suspicion keeps people looking at each other instead of at leadership. This sounds like normal office friction, but real friction doesn't consistently trace back to the same source repeating the same story to different people. Notice if the tension between you and a coworker only ever comes from what your manager told you they said. Because a team that stops trusting each other stops watching the person actually pulling the strings. I guess I'll just stay and finish it myself. The words land heavier than a direct request ever could, and somehow you end up staying late without ever actually being asked. Psychologists describe this as guilt tripping, a manipulation pattern that attaches moral weight to ordinary boundaries so that saying no feels like cruelty rather than a normal limit. A manager who sighs about how much they've sacrificed for the team isn't venting. They're converting your personal time into a debt you supposedly owe. A boss who mentions how disappointed leadership will be if the deadline slips isn't sharing information. They're outsourcing their own anxiety onto you. A supervisor who frames unpaid extra hours as just what it takes to be a team player isn't describing dedication. They're redefining exploitation as loyalty. It works because most people would rather absorb the extra hours than be seen as the one who let the team down. This sounds like commitment, but real commitment doesn't require guilt to be sustained. Notice if the extra hours are always framed around their disappointment, never around fair compensation. Because a request wrapped in guilt was never really a request. It was a demand in softer clothing. Your manager tells you that you're the only one who can handle a task, and the praise feels good for exactly as long as it takes them to hand you more work than anyone else on the team. Psychologists studying workplace influence describe this as strategic flattery, praise timed specifically to lower resistance right before a request. A boss who calls you irreplaceable right before asking you to cover someone else's shift isn't recognizing your value, they're leveraging it. A manager who praises your work ethic publicly, then quietly assigns you the heaviest workload, isn't rewarding you, they're using the compliment as an incentive to accept more. A supervisor whose praise always arrives moments before a favor is asked isn't building morale, they're building compliance. It works because praise lowers your guard exactly when scrutiny would serve you best. This sounds like recognition, but real recognition doesn't come with an invoice attached. Notice what request follows the compliment, not just the compliment itself. Because praise that's never separated from a demand isn't appreciation. It's a setup with better manners. One person on the team gets flexible hours and forgiving deadlines, while everyone else scrambles under the same rules stretched tighter. Psychologists studying group dynamics note that favoritism isn't just unfair, it's a control mechanism, a way of keeping the rest of the team competing for approval instead of questioning the manager's decisions. A boss who shields one employee from criticism while publicly correcting others isn't being inconsistent. They're establishing a hierarchy of who's safe and who isn't. A manager who gives the same instructions to everyone, but only enforces them selectively, isn't overworked. They're deciding who gets to be exempt and who has to prove themselves. A supervisor who lets a favorite bend the rules while reminding everyone else of the rules isn't playing favorites by accident. They're using it to keep the rest of the team anxious and compliant. It works because uncertainty about where you stand keeps people working harder to earn a status that was never actually up for negotiation. This sounds like personality differences, but real differences in working style don't consistently map on to who never gets held accountable. Notice who the rules seem to bend for and who they never bend for. Because favoritism isn't about liking someone more, it's about keeping everyone else guessing. You raise a concern about how you were treated, and somehow within minutes, you're the one apologizing for bringing it up. Psychologists call this pattern DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender, and it shows up in workplace confrontations almost exactly like it does in personal relationships. A manager who denies saying something you clearly remember, then criticizes your tone for questioning them, isn't clarifying a misunderstanding, they're flipping the narrative before it can be examined. A boss who responds to feedback about their behavior by listing everything they've done for you isn't addressing the concern, they're converting it into a debt you now owe them. A supervisor who claims to feel attacked the moment they're held accountable isn't being sensitive, they're using your empathy as a shield against consequences. It works because most people hesitate to keep pushing once the other person appears hurt, even if that hurt appeared suspiciously fast. This sounds like a misunderstanding spiraling, but real misunderstandings don't reliably end with you apologizing for noticing a problem. Notice who ends up comforting whom after you raise the original concern. Because a boss who can't be confronted without becoming the victim was never actually open to being confronted at all. Your manager clearly said the promotion was yours next quarter, and now, months later, they insist it was always just a possibility, and somehow you're the one who misunderstood. Psychologists studying workplace gaslighting note this pattern is especially effective because promises about the future are inherently hard to prove after the fact. A boss who verbally promises advancement, then denies it was ever concrete, isn't being cautious about commitments, they're protecting themselves from the accountability of having made one. A manager who shifts the goalposts each time you meet the previous requirement isn't raising standards, they're making sure the promotion stays permanently out of reach. A supervisor who suggests you misremembered a conversation you have clear memory of isn't correcting confusion, they're rewriting the record because there's no paper trail to contradict them. It works because verbal promises leave no evidence, and once doubt is introduced, most people question their own memory before they question their boss's honesty. This sounds like changing business needs, but real changes in circumstance come with explanation, not with denial that anything was promised at all. Notice if every promotion conversation happens only verbally, never in writing. Because a promise with no paper trail was never designed to be kept. Your manager mentions, almost in passing, that a coworker is really stepping up lately, and suddenly you're working late trying to prove you're stepping up too. Psychologists studying workplace dynamics describe this as manufactured competition, a tactic that increases output by pitting employees against each other instead of managing performance directly. A boss who compares your numbers to a coworker's in casual conversation isn't sharing context, they're planting a rivalry that didn't exist a moment ago. A manager who praises one employee specifically in front of another isn't celebrating success, they're using comparison as quiet pressure. A supervisor who frames a single open position as something several people are being considered for, when it was never really competitive, isn't being transparent. They're extracting extra effort from everyone under the guise of opportunity. It works because most people respond to perceived competition with more effort, even when the competition was invented specifically to produce that response. This sounds like healthy motivation, but real motivation doesn't require secretly pitting coworkers against each other to function. Notice if the comparison always seems to arrive right before a demanding task. Because a rivalry engineered by management isn't ambition, it's leverage wearing ambition's clothes. You ask for clear instructions, and the answer comes back so tangled with conditions and exceptions that you're not sure what was actually decided. Psychologists studying workplace communication note that deliberate vagueness gives managers an easy exit. If nothing was clearly promised, nothing can be clearly broken. A boss who gives instructions that shift slightly every time you ask for clarification isn't being thorough. They're making sure no version of the instructions can be held against them later. A manager who answers direct questions with long, circular explanations isn't overwhelmed. They're avoiding an answer specific enough to be quoted back to them. A supervisor whose expectations always seem to change right after you meet them isn't adapting to new information. They're using confusion as permission to keep moving the target. It works because confusion feels like miscommunication rather than manipulation, and most people blame themselves for not understanding rather than questioning why the explanation was so unclear in the first place. This sounds like poor communication skills, but real poor communication is consistently vague with everyone, not strategically vague only when accountability is on the line. Notice if the confusion only appears around decisions your boss doesn't want to be pinned to. Because clarity that conveniently disappears wasn't ever an accident. Your manager offers you a chance to lead a big project, framed as a reward, and only later do you realize it came with unspoken expectations you never actually agreed to. Psychologists describe this as transactional manipulation, where a gift or opportunity is quietly designed to create leverage rather than genuine advancement. A boss who offers you visibility on a project, then expects unquestioned loyalty in return, isn't rewarding your effort. They're planting a debt disguised as generosity. A manager who reminds you of the opportunity they gave you every time you push back on something isn't offering context. They're converting a past favor into present-day control. A supervisor who does favor after favor, each one slightly obligating you further, isn't building your career. They're building a ledger they intend to collect on. It works because reciprocity is one of the strongest human instincts, and most people comply with unreasonable requests just to avoid feeling like they didn't repay a kindness. This sounds like mentorship, but real mentorship doesn't keep a running tally. Notice if every opportunity from this person eventually gets mentioned again as something you owe them for. Because an opportunity that comes with an invisible invoice was never really a gift. One week your manager is warm, engaged, and full of praise. The next, they're cold and distant, and you spend days trying to figure out what you did wrong. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement, and research on behavior shows unpredictable rewards create stronger attachment than consistent ones. It's the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. A boss who is unpredictably warm keeps you chasing the good days far more than a consistently distant boss ever could. A manager whose approval comes and goes without any clear pattern keeps you working harder for it than one whose expectations are simply stable. A supervisor who praises rarely, but just often enough to keep hope alive, gets more effort from their team than one who praises consistently. It works because your brain treats uncertainty as a reason to try harder, not as a signal to disengage. This sounds like a moody workplace, but real mood swings don't reliably follow a pattern that keeps you working overtime to earn back what was randomly withdrawn. Notice if you feel more anxious than secure around this person's approval. Because consistency builds trust. Unpredictability builds dependency. Your manager asks you to do something slightly outside your job, framed casually, but the way they watch your reaction feels like more than curiosity. Psychologists studying workplace power dynamics note that loyalty tests are rarely announced as such. They're disguised as small, deniable requests designed to measure compliance before something bigger is asked. A boss who asks you to cover for a mistake that isn't yours isn't seeking a favor. They're checking whether you'll protect them before they trust you with more. A manager who shares information just between us, then watches to see if it stays contained, isn't confiding. They're testing your discretion. A supervisor who assigns a task that conflicts slightly with company policy just to see if you'll flag it isn't making an oversight. They're gauging how far you'll go without pushing back. It works because passing these small tests quietly earns you more trust to be tested further, and refusing feels like risking the relationship. This sounds like a normal request, but real requests don't come with someone quietly watching for your hesitation. Notice if the ask feels slightly off, and the reaction to your response feels more important than the task itself. Because loyalty that has to be tested was never really trust to begin with. Every task somehow becomes urgent the moment it's assigned, regardless of how much lead time actually exists. Psychologists studying workplace pressure note that artificial deadlines work because urgency shuts down the part of the brain that would otherwise ask whether the timeline is even realistic. A manager who assigns a 2-week task with a 2-day deadline isn't planning poorly. They're keeping you in a permanent state of rushed compliance. A boss who moves deadlines up without explanation, then moves them back once you've already sacrificed your evening, isn't disorganized. They're testing how much urgency they can manufacture before you push back. A supervisor whose every request comes with "as soon as possible," regardless of actual priority, isn't communicating urgency. They're training you to treat everything as equally critical, which makes it easier to demand anything at any time. It works because a permanent sense of urgency prevents you from ever stepping back to question whether the pace is reasonable. This sounds like a fast-paced job, but a genuinely fast-paced job has real deadlines that don't mysteriously soften once you've already rushed. Notice if the urgency evaporates the instant you actually deliver early. Because deadlines that keep shifting were never really about the work getting done. Your manager praises you enthusiastically in a team meeting, and later, privately, uses that same praise as leverage to ask for something you wouldn't otherwise agree to. Psychologists studying persuasion note that public praise creates a social identity you feel pressure to live up to, which makes it a surprisingly effective setup for a private request. A boss who calls you the most dedicated person on the team in front of everyone, then privately asks you to skip a boundary you'd normally hold, is using the public label as leverage against your own image. A manager who praises your flexibility publicly, then quietly expects you to always be the one who adjusts, isn't celebrating a trait. They're locking you into a role. A supervisor who compliments your loyalty in front of leadership, then uses that same reputation to ask you to stay silent about something uncomfortable, isn't building your reputation. They're weaponizing it. It works because contradicting the public version of yourself feels like a bigger cost than simply complying. This sounds like recognition, but real recognition doesn't come back later as an obligation. Notice if compliments from meetings resurface privately as reasons you should agree to something. Because praise that gets cashed in later was never just praise. You notice you're the last to hear about changes, left off certain emails, or excluded from casual conversations that used to include you. Psychologists studying workplace control describe isolation as one of the most effective tactics precisely because it happens quietly, without any single moment you can point to as the problem. A manager who slowly stops looping you into meetings you used to attend isn't streamlining communication. They're cutting off your access to information that would otherwise protect you. A boss who redirects your questions to be answered only by them, never by coworkers, isn't being helpful. They're making sure you depend entirely on their version of events. A supervisor who subtly discourages your team from talking to you about certain topics isn't managing gossip. They're making sure no one compares notes about how you're actually being treated. It works because isolation makes you the only source of your own perspective, with no one to check it against. This sounds like a shift in workflow, but real shifts in workflow don't consistently narrow down to one person losing access while everyone else keeps theirs. Notice if you're the only one who seems to be missing the same kinds of information repeatedly. Because isolation isn't always a wall. Sometimes it's just quietly closing doors one at a time. You receive feedback that's vague, hard to act on, and somehow always delivered in front of other people. Psychologists studying workplace dynamics note that feedback delivered publicly, without specifics, often serves to display authority rather than to actually improve performance. A manager who criticizes your work in a group setting instead of privately isn't being efficient. They're using the audience to reinforce their position over yours. A boss who gives feedback so vague you can't actually act on it isn't struggling to articulate the issue. They're keeping you in a permanent state of trying to guess what they want. A supervisor who saves criticism for moments when others are present, but praises privately when no one's watching, isn't being consistent. They're controlling how your competence is perceived by everyone else in the room. It works because vague public correction keeps you anxious and compliant without ever giving you anything concrete enough to defend yourself against. This sounds like direct management, but real direct management gives you something specific enough to actually improve. Notice if the feedback is sharpest in front of an audience and vaguest when you ask for detail. Because feedback that can't be acted on was never really about your growth. You've already invested years into this job, and that investment is exactly why leaving feels unthinkable, even when everything about the role has gotten worse. Psychologists call this the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to keep investing in something simply because of what's already been given, even when walking away would clearly be the wiser choice. A manager who reminds you how far you've already come in the company isn't offering encouragement. They're using your own history as a leash. A boss who mentions the training and opportunities they've invested in you every time you consider other options isn't expressing pride. They're converting past generosity into present-day obligation. A supervisor who frames leaving as throwing away everything you've built isn't giving career advice. They're making the exit feel like a loss rather than the relief it actually might be. It works because the mind hates admitting that time was wasted, and staying feels like avoiding that admission, even when staying creates far more waste than leaving ever would. This sounds like loyalty, but real loyalty is chosen fresh, not defended because of what's already been spent. Notice if "you've already come this far" is the only argument left for staying. Because a job that only holds you through sunk cost was never holding you through actual value. By the end of a long, draining meeting, you agree to something you would have pushed back on an hour earlier. Psychologists call this decision fatigue, the idea that every choice drains mental energy, and by the end of a long stretch of decisions, the mind reaches for whatever requires the least resistance. A manager who saves the real ask for the very end of a long meeting isn't running out of time. They're counting on your exhaustion to lower your guard. A boss who debates the same point repeatedly until you finally agree isn't persuading you with logic. They're waiting you out until saying yes is easier than continuing to disagree. A supervisor who schedules the hardest conversations late in the day, when everyone is already tired, isn't being inefficient. They're using fatigue as leverage they didn't have to argue for. It works because a tired brain chooses relief over accuracy almost every time. This sounds like a demanding schedule, but a demanding schedule doesn't consistently place the most important asks at the exact moment you're least equipped to evaluate them. Notice if you agreed because you were convinced, or simply because you were too depleted to keep resisting. Because consent given out of exhaustion was never really consent at all. Suddenly your manager is warmer than usual, praising your work constantly, checking in more often than they ever have, and it feels wonderful right up until the moment they ask for something enormous. Psychologists studying workplace manipulation note that a sudden increase in warmth right before a major request is rarely coincidental. It's a setup designed to make refusal feel like betraying newfound goodwill. A boss who becomes unusually attentive right before asking you to take on a coworker's entire workload isn't building a better relationship. They're softening you up for the ask. A manager who showers you with public recognition the same week they need you to sacrifice a weekend isn't rewarding past performance. They're prepaying for future compliance. A supervisor whose warmth consistently spikes right before a demanding request isn't developing genuine rapport. They're timing affection strategically. It works because refusing someone who just went out of their way to be kind feels uncomfortable, even when the kindness had a very specific expiration date. This sounds like a good week at work, but a good week that always precedes a big ask isn't really about you. Notice if the warmth has a pattern tied to timing rather than to anything you actually did. Because affection that arrives right on schedule before a demand isn't connection, it's preparation. You mentioned feeling exhausted, and your manager insists you're just being dramatic, or that everyone feels this way, until you start doubting whether your own exhaustion is even real. Psychologists studying workplace gaslighting note that dismissing someone's stated experience is one of the clearest markers of the pattern, regardless of how calmly it's delivered. A boss who responds to burnout with comparisons to how hard they work isn't offering perspective, they're invalidating your experience by making it about theirs. A manager who insists your workload is totally manageable while you're visibly struggling isn't being encouraging. They're overriding your own read of your capacity. A supervisor who reframes your need for rest as a personal failing rather than a reasonable response to an unreasonable workload isn't motivating you. They're making sure you blame yourself instead of the structure that caused it. It works because most people would rather doubt their own limits than challenge someone with authority over their job. This sounds like tough love, but real tough love doesn't require you to disbelieve your own exhaustion in order to keep functioning. Notice if your stated limits are consistently met with denial rather than acknowledgement. Because burnout dismissed enough times doesn't disappear, it just stops being something you're allowed to name. Keep this up, and good things will happen for you. The promise sounds encouraging, but it never actually names anything, and months later, nothing concrete has changed. Psychologists studying persuasion note that vague future promises create a sense of inevitability without requiring any real commitment, which makes them a low-cost way to extract ongoing effort. A manager who hints at advancement without ever specifying a timeline or title isn't building your career, they're keeping you motivated on a promise that costs them nothing to make. A boss who says, "We'll talk about your future here soon," every time the conversation gets close to specifics isn't planning, they're deflecting. A supervisor whose encouragement is always about potential and never about a concrete next step isn't investing in you. They're extracting extra effort using the mere suggestion of a reward. It works because hope is a powerful motivator, and vague promises are cheap enough to repeat indefinitely without ever having to deliver anything. This sounds like mentorship, but real mentorship eventually points to something specific and time-bound. Notice if every conversation about your future stays comfortably vague, no matter how long you've been asking, because a promise with no shape was never meant to be kept, only repeated. You raise a concern in a meeting, and instead of responding, your manager just looks at you and says nothing, letting the silence stretch until you start backpedaling. Psychologists studying negotiation tactics note that silence creates pressure most people can't tolerate for long, and a skilled communicator can use that discomfort to make you concede without them ever having to argue. A boss who lets your objection hang in uncomfortable silence isn't processing your point. They're waiting for you to soften it yourself. A manager who responds to pushback with a long pause instead of a rebuttal isn't speechless. They're using the silence to make you feel like you overstepped. A supervisor who uses silence selectively, only when you challenge them, but never in ordinary conversation, isn't naturally quiet. They're deploying it strategically. It works because most people rush to fill uncomfortable silence, often by walking back their own position just to end the tension. This sounds like someone taking your concerns seriously, but real consideration eventually produces a response, not an indefinite pause designed to outlast your resolve. Notice if the silence only appears the moment you push back, never at any other time. Because silence used as leverage isn't thoughtfulness. It's a tactic disguised as patience. A decision your manager made goes wrong, and somehow, by the time it reaches leadership, the story has shifted to make it sound like your call. Psychologists studying workplace accountability note that this pattern relies on the fact that most decisions in a hierarchy are made verbally, leaving no clear record of who actually chose what. A manager who approves a plan, then distances themselves the moment it fails, isn't reflecting on the outcome. They're rewriting who owns it. A boss who says, "I thought you had that handled," about something they never delegated clearly isn't confused. They're creating deniability after the fact. A supervisor who consistently escapes consequences while the same mistakes always land on your record isn't unlucky. They're using you as a buffer between their decisions and any fallout. It works because contradicting a superior's version of events in front of leadership feels far riskier than quietly absorbing blame that isn't yours. This sounds like normal workplace friction, but real friction doesn't consistently land the consequences on the person with the least power to contest them. Notice who ends up explaining themselves after every failure, and who never has to. Because blame that always flows downward isn't accountability. It's just gravity, engineered. If you really cared about this company, you'd stay late without being asked. The sentence isn't framed as a threat, but the implication underneath is impossible to miss. Psychologist Susan Forward described this pattern as emotional blackmail, built on a demand, your hesitation, pressure through guilt, and finally, submission out of exhaustion rather than agreement. A manager who ties your commitment to unpaid extra effort turns every reasonable boundary into a loyalty test. A boss who frames pushback as a lack of dedication turns ordinary limits into something to feel ashamed of. A supervisor who reminds you what the company has done for you every time you assert a boundary turns basic employment into an unpayable debt. It works because it attacks something people are reluctant to risk: being seen as committed, being trusted, keeping their position secure. This sounds like passion for the job, but real passion doesn't require proof through self-sacrifice on demand. Notice if saying no to unreasonable requests gets treated as a character flaw rather than a normal limit. Because leadership that requires emotional payment for basic fairness was never really leadership. It was leverage dressed as culture. Your manager casually mentions how many people applied for your role, or how easily they could find someone else, and suddenly every request feels non-negotiable. Psychologists studying workplace power dynamics note that manufactured job insecurity is one of the most efficient ways to extract compliance without ever making an explicit threat. A boss who reminds you how replaceable you are right before asking for something unreasonable isn't giving you context, they're weaponizing your fear of losing income. A manager who compares you unfavorably to hypothetical other candidates isn't motivating you to improve, they're keeping you anxious enough to comply without resistance. A supervisor who brings up the job market right after you raise a boundary isn't discussing economics, they're reminding you who holds the leverage. It works because financial insecurity narrows your options down to compliance, even when the threat was never made directly. This sounds like honest feedback about competition, but honest feedback doesn't consistently arrive as a warning right after you assert a limit. Notice if the reminder of your replaceability always shows up in response to pushback, never as neutral information. Because a threat doesn't need to be spoken outright to still function as one. Every few weeks, something becomes an emergency that only your manager can solve, and somehow the crisis always resolves the moment they personally step in. Psychologists studying organizational behavior note that manufactured urgency can serve a manager's need to appear indispensable, even when the underlying problem was avoidable or exaggerated. A boss who lets small issues snowball before addressing them isn't overwhelmed, they're allowing the crisis to grow large enough that their intervention looks heroic. A manager who frames routine problems as emergencies only they can navigate isn't managing effectively, they're making themselves look irreplaceable by inflating the stakes. A supervisor whose department seems to lurch from crisis to crisis, each one resolved just in time by their intervention, isn't unlucky. They're benefiting from a pattern that keeps leadership dependent on them. It works because crises create urgency that discourages anyone from stepping back to ask whether the emergency was necessary in the first place. This sounds like a genuinely difficult workload, but a genuinely difficult workload doesn't consistently produce crises that only this one person can resolve. Notice if the emergencies always seem to require this specific person's intervention and never anyone else's. Because a hero who keeps appearing at the exact right moment might be the one who started the fire. Just send it whenever, no rush, somehow still means tonight, and you find yourself finishing tasks well after you've clocked out without ever being explicitly asked to. Psychologists studying workplace boundaries note that unpaid labor is often extracted through implication rather than direct instruction, precisely because implied expectations are harder to refuse than explicit ones. A manager who sends messages late at night, just for you to see whenever, isn't being considerate of your time, they're normalizing the expectation that you're always reachable. A boss who frames after-hours responsiveness as just being a team player isn't describing dedication, they're redefining unpaid availability as a character trait. A supervisor who never explicitly asks for overtime but consistently assigns workloads that require it isn't unaware of the math, they're relying on your own initiative to absorb the gap. It works because nothing was technically demanded, which makes it harder to point to any single moment as unreasonable. This sounds like flexibility, but real flexibility runs in both directions, not just toward more hours given for free. Notice if the workload consistently requires hours no one ever explicitly asked you to work. Because an expectation that's never stated out loud can still function exactly like a rule. The last person in this role never had this problem. The comment isn't framed as criticism, but it lands exactly like one, and you find yourself trying to outperform someone who may not even be real. Psychologists studying workplace influence note that comparison is a particularly effective control tactic because it doesn't require a direct command, just an implied standard you feel compelled to chase. A manager who frequently references how another employee, team, or predecessor handled things isn't offering useful context, they're establishing a moving target you're always slightly behind on. A boss who praises a hypothetical ideal employee in the abstract isn't describing an aspiration, they're using an invented standard to keep you feeling perpetually inadequate. A supervisor who compares your output to people in entirely different roles or circumstances isn't being fair. They're using an impossible comparison specifically because it can never be satisfied. It works because comparison bypasses the question of whether the standard is even reasonable, replacing it with a race that has no finish line. This sounds like healthy benchmarking, but real benchmarking uses specific, comparable metrics, not vague references to someone who conveniently can't be checked. Notice if the comparison is always slightly unfalsifiable, impossible to verify or challenge directly, because a standard you can never quite reach was never meant to be reachable. "Let's keep this between us" gets said so often that you start to realize almost nothing in this relationship happens in the open. Psychologists studying workplace misconduct note that excessive secrecy is one of the clearest signals that something being hidden isn't merely private, it's something that couldn't survive scrutiny. A manager who insists on verbal-only conversations about sensitive topics isn't respecting discretion, they're avoiding a paper trail that could later hold them accountable. A boss who asks you to keep certain decisions confidential from HR or other leadership isn't protecting the team, they're insulating their own behavior from oversight. A supervisor who frames every uncomfortable conversation as something that must stay private isn't building trust, they're making sure no pattern can ever be assembled from isolated incidents. It works because each individual request for confidentiality sounds reasonable on its own, and only the accumulation reveals a pattern of concealment. This sounds like normal workplace discretion, but real discretion protects other people's privacy, not the person asking for it every single time something questionable happens. Notice if the requests for secrecy specifically cluster around moments that would look bad if anyone else saw them. Because confidentiality that only ever protects one person was never really about privacy. Every time you raise a legitimate concern, you're told, "It's being handled," or "Things will get better soon," and somehow nothing ever actually changes. Psychologists studying organizational behavior note that vague reassurance is one of the cheapest ways to diffuse a complaint without ever having to resolve the underlying issue. A manager who responds to every concern with comforting words but no concrete action isn't managing a difficult situation, they're managing your patience instead. A boss who says, "I hear you," repeatedly without ever following up isn't listening. They're using acknowledgement as a substitute for actually addressing the problem. A supervisor who promises change next quarter indefinitely isn't planning ahead. They're pushing accountability far enough into the future that it never has to arrive. It works because reassurance feels like progress, even when nothing measurable has actually shifted. This sounds like a slow bureaucracy, but a slow bureaucracy eventually produces some change, even if delayed. Notice if the reassurance has been repeating for months with the same comforting words and zero visible movement. Because being told things will get better isn't the same as things actually getting better. You find yourself needing your manager's sign-off on things you're clearly capable of deciding alone, and somehow every small decision routes back through them. Psychologists studying workplace control note that unnecessary dependency is often engineered deliberately because an employee who constantly needs approval is far easier to manage than one who operates independently. A manager who requires check-ins for decisions well within your role isn't ensuring quality, they're making sure nothing happens without their fingerprints on it. A boss who discourages you from making calls without their input, even on routine matters, isn't being thorough. They're training you to distrust your own judgment. A supervisor who frames independence as a risk rather than a strength isn't protecting the team from mistakes, they're protecting their own sense of control. It works because constant reliance on approval slowly convinces you that you genuinely need it, even in areas where you clearly don't. This sounds like careful oversight, but real oversight scales down as competence is demonstrated, not stays permanently fixed regardless of your track record. Notice if your need for their approval has stayed exactly the same, no matter how long you've done the job well. Because dependency that never shrinks was never really about your development. You're so good under pressure arrives right before you're handed a workload no one else was willing to take. Psychologists studying persuasion note that strategic praise, delivered right before a request, is remembered less as a genuine compliment and more as a setup once the pattern becomes visible. A manager who praises your calm demeanor specifically before assigning you the most stressful task on the team isn't recognizing a strength, they're exploiting it. A boss who calls you so easygoing right before asking you to accept something unreasonable isn't complimenting your personality, they're using it as an excuse to expect less resistance. A supervisor whose praise consistently precedes a bigger ask, never simply standing alone, isn't building your confidence, they're softening you up. It works because compliments lower your guard exactly when scrutiny would serve you best. This sounds like encouragement, but real encouragement doesn't reliably arrive moments before a demand. Notice what request follows the compliment, not just the compliment itself. Because praise that's never separated from an ask isn't recognition. It's a setup, wearing kindness as a disguise. You see a clear problem with a decision in a team meeting, but everyone else is nodding, so you stay quiet too, even though you're fairly sure others share your doubt. Psychologist Irving Janis first documented this pattern after studying decisions that went catastrophically wrong, specifically because dissent felt riskier than silence. A manager who frames disagreement as not being a team player isn't encouraging debate. They're making dissent socially costly before anyone even raises it. A boss who visibly rewards agreement and subtly punishes pushback in meetings isn't fostering collaboration. They're training the room to stay quiet. A supervisor who moves quickly past any hint of hesitation rather than pausing to invite it isn't being efficient. They're preventing consensus from ever being actually tested. It works because breaking from the group feels riskier than staying wrong together, even when staying wrong has real consequences for the whole team. This sounds like a harmonious workplace, but real harmony can tolerate disagreement without punishing it. Notice if your silence in meetings comes from agreement or simply from not wanting to be the only one who speaks. Because a team that never disagrees out loud isn't aligned. It's just quiet. Something is clearly going wrong on the team, and your manager is aware of it, but does nothing, apparently waiting for someone else to raise the issue first. Psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley proved decades ago that responsibility diffuses in groups when everyone assumes someone else will act, often no one does. A manager who notices a problem but waits to see if HR or another department addresses it first isn't being cautious. They're avoiding the discomfort of being the one who has to act. A boss who lets a toxic dynamic between coworkers continue without intervening isn't oblivious. They're relying on the diffusion of responsibility to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. A supervisor who only acts once a problem becomes impossible to ignore isn't slow to notice. They're strategically delaying involvement until someone else has already absorbed the risk of speaking up. It works because inaction feels safer when responsibility is shared, even when sharing it changes nothing about the outcome for the people actually affected. This sounds like restraint, but real restraint is a choice, not an indefinite wait for someone else to go first. Notice if your manager consistently waits until a problem is undeniable before doing anything about it. Because leadership that only acts once it's forced to isn't leadership. It's just delayed liability. You and several coworkers notice the same pattern of dysfunction, but when it's raised, leadership insists the culture is actually healthy, and somehow you all end up doubting what you clearly experienced together. Psychologists studying organizational gaslighting note that this pattern is especially effective at scale because it isn't just one person's memory being challenged, it's an entire group's shared perception. A leadership team that responds to concerns about culture with survey results, instead of acknowledgement, isn't investigating the issue. They're using selective data to override lived experience. A manager who insists that turnover is due to people not being the right fit, rather than the environment itself, isn't offering an honest explanation. They're redirecting blame away from the actual cause. A company that repeats, "We value transparency," while consistently punishing the people who are transparent, isn't describing its actual values. It's describing an aspiration used to silence contradiction. It works because disputing an organization's official narrative feels far riskier than simply doubting your own perception instead. This sounds like a difference of perspective, but real differences in perspective don't require an entire group to independently doubt the same clear pattern. Notice if the official story requires you to distrust what several people experienced firsthand. Because a culture that gaslights its own employees about its culture was never healthy to begin with, it was just well defended.